I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Kathy Bovill today for a number of reasons. First one is that we've tried twice and it's not been possible, and we are thrilled that she's made it today. And actually, Kathy, I think there's something lovely about you being here today. We're going to talk to some students that have been involved in scholarship this afternoon, and it feels like a really good place to invite you to join us. So I'm just very glad to see you, and so glad you arrived before time, so I didn't stress through my coffee break. So that's great. I was just chatting to Kathy. I first met Kathy a few years back in a conference in Norway. And when I wanted to think about sort of launching work within praxis with students as partners in scholarship, she was my go-to person for Keynote for today. So I'm delighted that she's here. Kathy has worked in a number of universities, but is currently up in Edinburgh. Although I think, Kathy, you were nearer me at Winchester at one point, weren't you? So for a while, we had some engagement there. So right. I'm just going to hand straight over to Kathy to do any further introduction that she'd like to do and sit back and enjoy this keynote about student-staff partnerships in the scholarship of teaching and learning.
Thanks so much, Claire, and I'm absolutely delighted to be with you, and so grateful to you for inviting me to be part of what looked like a fantastic programme today. So I hope that you've all been enjoying the sessions so far, and that you'll continue to do so through the day. And yes, I'm sorry that it took us a little while to get this together, and I think one of the faults was certainly on my part. I think there was one date when we were going to try and do this, and I had COVID. So you know, we're in the context we're in at the moment, and dealing with all of that. But I'm thrilled to be here, and yes, hopefully I'm going to take you on a bit of a tour through student staff partnerships in the scholarship of teaching and learning, and hopefully have some space in there to hear a little bit from you as well. We've got a few interactive parts of this session.
Hello, Roisin.
Oh, and can everybody hear me okay? Sorry, I just heard an interruption.
Yeah, I've muted that participant.
Okay.
Go for it.
Thank you. Sorry, I can't tell once I'm in slideshow mode. So great, let's get underway. And so my plan is to kind of do a little bit of an introduction to sort of partnerships in learning and teaching and in scholarship of teaching and learning. Then think about sort of what we might mean by co-creating SOTL or partnerships in SOTL, and I'll explain why I quite often use the term co-creation as an alternative to partnerships, and that's not that everybody else has to use this term, but I want to kind of explain why I defer to that term quite a lot. I want to work our way through sharing some benefits, some examples, as well as being honest about the fact that there are some challenges to this kind of work and how might we overcome some of those challenges. And we'll look at things like reward mechanisms, which is one of the things that comes up often as a question about involving students. And then I'll come round to sort of looking at the importance of relationships as a foundation for co-creation and how important it is that we think about how we build relationships between staff and students. And I'll make sure that I finish hopefully in a timely manner so that we can have some questions and answers at the end. So that's the plan. So onwards from here. So starting off, just sort of thinking about what do we actually mean by partnership? And this was a definition that I wrote with some colleagues, some great colleagues in the United States. Some of you may have come across Alison Cook-Sather and Peter Felton, both scholars who are doing fantastic work in this area and wider areas around scholarship of teaching and learning. And we were writing about partnerships specifically in learning and teaching when we created this definition where we suggest that it's a collaborative reciprocal process through which all participants have the opportunity to contribute equally, although not necessarily in the same ways, to curricular or pedagogical conceptualization, decision-making, implementation, investigation, or analysis. And so that investigation, I would hope, starts to sort of show that research is part of this. But at this point, we were thinking very specifically about partnership and learning and teaching. And I'm aware that when we talk about research or scholarship of teaching and learning, that can broaden out a little bit from that focus on learning and teaching. So we'll come to that in due course. But what I want to point out in that definition, and it's always been slightly contentious with some people, is this idea of contributing equally, and that within a higher education setting, that can sometimes cause challenges of whether we're actually able to achieve that kind of level of equality, even though we're saying that those contributions might not necessarily be happening in the same ways. So let's think about this in a little bit more detail in terms of thinking about how we define what partnership is. And so I came up with this kind of very loose continuum, if you like, to try and help people make sense of some of the terminology that's around in the sector. And I'm aware there's huge amounts of different terms people use. So this is only a few of them. But I'm aware that, for example, student engagement, that's a term that many people use across universities, particularly in the UK and the US. It's a very common term. But sometimes it's a term that's so broad that it can almost feel a little bit meaningless sometimes. So it can mean everything from a student actually turning up to study or turning up to a tutorial, or so literally turning up, right through to someone that really wants to read beyond the subject, that's constantly asking deep questions, they're showing a kind of deep curiosity. And those are sort of very different ends of a spectrum of student engagement. So it does feel like quite a broad term. And then partnership at the other end, if we're sort of suggesting that it implies a form of equality, then that is taking us to quite a different place in terms of the relationship between the staff and the student and the level of agency that a student might have in that process. And if we go along the way a little bit, sort of active learning, you know, what's the difference between partnership and active learning? Well, often active learning might involve trying to ensure that students are being active cognitively. Sometimes people see it very much as sort of active in terms of they're the people asking questions, or they're being more vocal perhaps in an online class, or you know, that kind of an online sort of interaction of any kind. But actually, yeah, it can often be much more cognitive. A lot of people associate it with small group work, things like that, but getting students to be much more involved in learning. Now, that's fine, but I think there's quite a difference then between what we might call co-creation and partnership, in that we start to see that there are levels of kind of negotiation and students actually making decisions about learning and teaching, or about other aspects of their student experience, once we move into sort of co-creation and partnership. So I would say active learning doesn't tend to always suggest there has to be negotiation taking place. It doesn't tend to suggest that decision making is shared in any way. And I think that's a key difference between active learning and perhaps something like co-creation or partnership. And in terms of co-creation and partnership, I would say I've veered towards using the term co-creation quite a lot, because I work as an academic developer. So I work ironically predominantly with staff, which is always interesting when you think that I work a lot around co-creation. But in that work with staff, I think a lot of colleagues have really struggled with the term partnership and saying, can we get there if we assess students? Is that really truly partnership? And so essentially co-creation gives this sense of the same kind of levels of building student agency, negotiating and sharing decision making, but maybe releases you from that necessity that you're saying, but we're going to be completely equal. So it's not so much that you're not aspiring towards partnership, but it's acknowledging that there is absolutely brilliant work going on where we're sharing many responsibility and sharing the kind of the decision-making process, but it sort of might not quite reach that idea of equality. So forgive me, I'm going to kind of interchange a little bit probably between using terms partnership and co-creation. So Peter Felton, in some work he did back in 2013, actually specifically looked at, if we think about scholarship of teaching and learning and how we go about that, then he proposed that there should be some principles underpinning good practice within scholarship of teaching and learning. And those principles include inquiry focused on student learning, that SOTL is grounded in context, it's methodologically sound, but key in here is it's conducted in partnership with students. So this was absolutely key as one of the principles of good practice in SOTL, as well as also being appropriately public. So really right in there, you know, in the kind of SOTL literature, this is something that is being tussled with, I think, quite substantially since that time when Peter Felton published that paper. We've got nearly 10 years where people have really tried and pushed to say that SOTL work is much more kind of effective. It's perhaps better practice when it's conducted in partnership with students. And related to the work that I did with Alison Cook-Sather and Peter Felton, we also came up in our work with partnership principles that seem to really underpin the kind of work that we're trying to promote. And these were around sharing responsibility, a shared respect, and a reciprocity within the work that we do. And I think those can be really helpful at getting us to really think through the kind of quality of work that we're doing with students rather than doing things to students. And I think that's a really subtle kind of change within partnership and co-creation. So let's move to thinking more specifically about kind of scholarship of teaching and learning and research. And there's a real range of practice. So I think one or two things are really worth pointing out here. One is that we can talk on the one hand about scholarship of teaching and learning, and we can talk on the other about subject-based research. And both of these are opportunities where students can participate in research and scholarship of different kinds, and both are sort of worthy of our exploration. Also, if you look at co-creation and partnership work, there seems to be quite a big difference between a range of practice on one hand that we might talk about as project-based. So perhaps a group of students one student or a group of students are maybe being employed or invited to be taking part in a project, which they do alongside staff. And they go about a SOTL project or a research project, or in many cases they do learning and teaching based co-creation. And that's sort of one style of doing co-creation. But another variation is where a teacher works with a whole group of students. And we can kind of come around to thinking about sort of differences between these two variations. One is not better than the other, if you like. I think I would say they offer slightly different things. And also, if you take the context within which you work, you probably find that one of those might be more manageable than another one at different points in time. Your context might dictate to you what's possible. But there is some evidence coming out that maybe whole group approaches might be seen as more inclusive because you're not actually having to select students in any way. But I think we need to be careful of assuming that just because a whole group is involved, that necessarily that means that everybody is equally participating. You know, we need to be quite careful of that kind of assumption, if you like. And then in some work I did a few years ago, I actually sort of created what I called a typology of co-creation to kind of illustrate this sort of range of practice that's possible. And so this typology was based on a whole range of questions that you could ask yourself around things like, which students are you going to involve? Are these students, for example, from last year? Are they students that are currently working with you, or are they going to be students that are coming maybe to study a course in future, or students who are going to be maybe they're at school at the moment and they're coming to the university next year? You know, which students are we involving? How many students are you involving? One, a small group? Are we talking 50 students, 100 students? What's the focus of that co-creation or that partnership? Is it curricular? Is it extracurricular and more widely focused on the kind of student experience as a whole? And are students receiving rewards as part of that process? And so the typology in some ways enables you to look at planning what kind of co-creation you might want to undertake. It's a way also that an institution can perhaps evaluate the sort of co-creation or partnership that's taking place. So it has a range of uses, but it's really just a kind of framework, which is quite helpful to really illustrate also the range of practice that's possible when we start to talk about co-creation. And again, I've slipped back to to partnership here when I've talked about benefits, and that's because quite a few of the publications speak specifically about the benefits of partnership. But I think many of these benefits are shared with co-creation, and I've sort of certainly looked at that myself in my work, and there's masses of overlap really between the benefits between the two. And some of the key kind of benefits are around enhanced engagement. So students feeling more motivated. We also see, particularly when it's learning and teaching related, we see greater kind of academic performance or better performance by students in assessments, for example. We also see greater metacognitive awareness by students, so a greater awareness of how they learn, and also an awareness of why teachers teach the way they teach, as well as sort of a sort of greater sense of them developing an identity around being a student, about being a future, whether it's a historian or a sociologist or whether it's a biologist, a greater sense of that developing identity, I think, from probably having conversations about learning far more than they normally do. And we also see a range of enhancements, which is often around teaching, and I've called it classroom experiences, but teaching and essentially learning experiences and the space where learning takes place. What's interesting here is all of these benefits we found actually were there for students and staff. They're just experienced in slightly different ways. So if I take just one example there, the metacognitive awareness, we also found that teachers who are involved in co-creation also tend to talk about having gained a better sense of why they do what they do in the way they do it. So I think fascinating that actually many of those benefits are shared. And then in a couple of other studies, Mercer Matson et al. Did an international systematic review of partnership literature back in 2017. And they also found, in addition to some of those early benefits that we found, that students tended to also report greater belonging, an enhanced sense of confidence, and they also talked of more positive relationships and greater trust, that students were reporting all of those kind of additional benefits. And then in some work that I've done more recently, I also looked at some more of the literature, and this was more specifically on co-creation actually, but what we seem to find there is that there's a sense that when students are more involved in co-creation, they tend to focus more on learning rather than their grades if assessment is involved in that co-creation. Students report that they appreciate that they get to practice working democratically. And that's fascinating if we think that many graduate attributes that universities will have include elements about developing kind of citizenship or sort of a societal sort of ethical stance, perhaps. And yet, how do we develop those kind of democratic skills in our students? I'm not necessarily sure that we focus on that. So fascinating that some students actually were reporting that. Some students saying they just felt more valued, they felt that learning was more relevant, and they also felt that learning was more culturally responsive. And I think that's something we'll come back to in terms of how we ensure that we're being aware of the context in which we work and some of the really high priority areas of higher education at the moment in terms of things like decolonization. We can come back to that. And these were findings in terms of benefits for where we were working as a whole group, if you like. So as opposed to the project type co-creation that I mentioned earlier. So lots of benefits there. But sometimes you can kind of think, how do you do this? Where do you go with this? How can we possibly make this happen? And there's a wonderful article from McGowan and Felton recently, which kind of really tries to help us move towards, we can be hopeful here. We don't be too worried by the fact that, yes, there are some challenges, and I will come to those shortly. But also we can actually sort of here, as they say, cultivate hopeful academic communities in which students are an active part, so we can focus together on the central problems facing our students and our communities. So there's something here about the real potential of involving students in being part of how we tussle with those really challenging issues that the centre of our universities. And so they come up with this fabulous kind of equation, if you like, agency plus pathways equals hope. And they define agency as I can change in meaningful ways despite the systems and structures constraining me. So how we kind of develop in staff and students a kind of agency to feel that you can contribute and in meaningful ways. That's actually a really key thing to learn. And pathways are being able to see specific and purposeful steps that you can take in order to make things happen. So if we can kind of have an increased agency, and we can highlight a range of pathways potentially that people can take towards solving problems, we can become more hopeful, essentially, is what they say. And I think that there's something here that we might be able to sort of build upon, where we are actively here trying to increase students' agency. If we can work together on the ways that perhaps we can enhance pathways and towards solving some of the kind of central problems we have in universities. So let's look at some other benefits, but potentially from partnership in scholarship of teaching and learning specifically. So we've got McGowan and Felton's statement there that they think that it helps us address central questions together. I think that's important to add. It also means we're not missing the perspectives of a really key stakeholder. I think often, you know, things that take place in universities that don't involve students, we are missing a key stakeholder there. There's an enhancement in terms of relevance where we involve students. And then I mentioned earlier about decolonisation. I think this is something that's sort of bubbling up in the literature and hasn't quite come to fruition yet. But there is this sense that if we are involving students, then not only does that enable us to consider kind of a greater equity in terms of the voices that are heard within our scholarship of teaching and learning, but it also enables us to think about the decolonisation challenge that we have and how to go about that decolonisation by involving students from all backgrounds in those conversations we have, and perhaps specifically inviting in marginalised students so that their voices are heard much more in the conversations we're having about how we design curricula, what kinds of research questions we should be asking. And doing scholarship of teaching and learning with students is a real change to the kind of what I would call almost more old style sense of research of sort of almost being seen as extracting data from students. So it's you can sense the difference in the tone when we start to talk about doing things with students, and they're researching with us, they're co-researchers, they're collaborators in SOTL, as opposed to kind of being people that we want to extract data from. It also enables us, when we talk to students and involve them meaningfully, we have the ability to sort of tap into greater creativity, greater perspectives and more multiple perspectives. We also have the potential to share ownership of the outcomes and the actions that come from research. And we also have that possibility where students also get the possibility of being able to experience authentic research and evaluation, which is fantastic. So I want to move to having a look at a few examples of practice, and then I'm going to pause after this and ensure that we've got a little bit of time to hear perhaps from some examples that you might have. So let me just run through a few of these just to give you some examples of practice. There's all sorts of great partnership and SOTL examples. But, you know, so I'm just giving you a little bit of an overview here of a few. So bear with me if you've got better examples, or, you know of something somewhere else and I've not mentioned it here. So this is just a little bit of a selection. So there's a great project, indulge me here, that I've gone first off with the University of Edinburgh project. But some colleagues in our public health school have come up with something they've called the Uncover project, and this is a project which is basically happened during COVID. And what they did was they were approached, so the academics within the public health unit were approached by the government, by policy bodies, and they were saying, can you do a rapid systematic review of everything we've got about treatments in COVID, everything we've got about some of the best approaches for hospitalization and how we keep health service staff safe, for example, in hospital during COVID. So basically COVID related systematic reviews that were needed by policy bodies. But these policy bodies and the government were basically saying we need that return to us within 3 weeks. So the turnaround time was like super crazy fast. And so they were thinking, how can we possibly do this? But we want to be supporting that kind of policy work. Excuse me. So they thought to themselves, we have a huge group of fantastic students on our Masters in Public Health who are all experienced healthcare professionals. And many of them are learning about systematic reviews as part of their master's course. And so they actually collaborated with the students to create a much bigger group that would enable them to do these rapid systematic reviews within the period of time that they had. And this has now become embedded within the work within that department of the university as a fantastic way of kind of enabling students to get authentic research experience whilst also enabling the department to actually respond to realistic real projects from that they were being approached about. So really nice example there from public health. If we move to biology, then a colleague at New York University has tried out quite an interesting approach where he invited students to design case studies, co-design them with him, which were focused on early entry introductory topics in biology, and they included things like photosynthesis. I think they included things around chemical bonds. There were a few other different topics, and they were ones where they were decided between the students and the staff about ones where students perhaps struggled sometimes with the topics and they weren't particularly well covered by case studies, and they made these case studies interactive. And so quite attractive case studies they created. And then what they did was they asked the students to present the case studies they created at a biology conference, a professional conference, get feedback on those. And then they published the case studies in some journals as well. So they were kind of showing the kind of teaching material that they were using. And then importantly, they also then undertook an evaluation study to look into how effective these case studies were in the teaching of those biology concepts and those introductory concepts in that first year class. So interesting sort of multiple layer of involvement of students in that particular example. And again, indulge me a little bit here. I've actually put in an example. This is actually from quite a long time ago when I was based at Queen Margaret University, so that's quite a while ago. But I wanted to include it as an example of a kind of whole group example. So this was a course that was focused on research methods on a professional education program. And so the students were learning about research methods. And so to me, it made a lot of sense for the students to be involved in evaluating the module that they were studying. So this was put together as a kind of action research project. The students were able to kind of suggest different things they wanted to evaluate. And I encourage the students to kind of pair up or work in a small group, or they could work individually, but they would come up with different suggestions of what they would like to evaluate about the module at different points during the module running. And many of the students led evaluation exercises, and all of the students were involved then in the collation and the making sense of what they found and sharing that back with the program team. And then a subgroup of that, those students actually sort of co-wrote a paper to share the outcomes from that evaluation in a international journal. But so quite unusual in some ways, but the key being that sort of opening out the evaluation process to say, maybe you've got good ideas as students, what you would like to actually see evaluated. And interestingly, one of my colleagues at the time said, are you sure you're open to anything being evaluated? And I looked sort of slightly taken aback by this, because I don't think I'd considered that I would have anything in there that I didn't think could be evaluated. So I was pretty open to evaluating anything. I think, but what they raised for me was this recognition that maybe not everybody is so comfortable hearing feedback on things that maybe they're a bit nervous of hearing. So I think it was a good reminder that we have to negotiate this space to make it maybe perhaps a safe space. Sometimes people call it a brave space, but we need to make it into an environment where students and staff feel that they can have these conversations and do this kind of work. And another project that I was involved in much more recently, I was very fortunate and had a Fulbright scholarship and was over in the United States just before COVID hit. And the reason I've included this one is because it was just the ability to push some boundaries that I hadn't been able to perhaps before. And this was whilst at Elon University, they invited me to do an optional module on their Masters in Higher Education. And so that flexibility of being able to try things out, one of the things I'd wanted to do for some years, but just hadn't had the space or the right place to do it, was the idea of creating a class research project. So an assessed project that we would all do together as a class. And so the students decided on the subject area, they decided how they would go about doing it, who would do what, and then in the end, what the outcome of that would be, what kind of style of outcome it would be. And so they investigated the perceptions of the staff and students on the Masters in Higher Education around partnership. And they created a really nice infographic that they decided that was what they wanted as an outcome from the project. And then we discussed as a class how that would actually be assessed. We collaborated on what would be the right criteria to use to assess a collaborative project like that. So quite unusual, but I wanted to kind of include that because I think maybe we don't do enough where we try to work together as a class or as a group to actually, to investigate things as a whole group of students and staff together. So it reminds me of sort of citizen science and things where we can really influence large scale projects too. Moving to University of Winchester, they have something called the Student Fellows Scheme, and there are many of these kinds of schemes at different universities around the UK particularly, and I just wanted to, this is one example. This is extracurricular, and students would apply for a small amount of money and work alongside a staff member to investigate something that they think could benefit from being sort of evaluated and learning from, so that it can put in place some changes going forward. So one example would be a student and staff member work together to investigate the experience of commuter students at the university, and they then kind of actually were able to make some recommendations, and the university took it seriously, and they did actually implement a range of changes, even small things such as commuting students needing lockers so that they didn't have to carry their books and their materials sort of backwards and forwards quite so often. So just things like that can be investigated. They've had all sorts of projects run over the years. So there's quite a number of those sort of schemes at different universities in the UK. Very interesting initiative from colleagues at University College London a few years ago. They decided to investigate the departments at the university that were scoring particularly low scores in the NSS, in the National Student Survey. But they decided to investigate that by actually inviting students to work alongside those departments to get them to think about how they could enhance elements of what they were doing in the department to try and improve those National Student Survey scores. And so the students were kind of researching alongside the staff to find out what it was that needed to be done. So yeah, quite interesting and quite successful project that they had there. There's a whole sort of ethical issue there around how you identify low performing departments and whether being labelled low performing is kind of helpful, but that's maybe for another day. But yeah, very interesting project that they did. And the last example I want to include here is an example called ULTRIS, which was undergraduate learning and teaching research internship scheme, I think, if I've got that right, from the University of Western Australia. And I think this is a really exciting example of work where they actually employed students to work with staff on areas of learning and teaching that they were saying, what could we be improving? And each year they would have a different theme. I think they had one year they had first year experience. They had another year where they investigated, all the projects were focused on having conversations outside the classroom between staff and students. So I think really interesting way of involving students to try to promote activity and research in a particular sort of priority area across an institution. So a really interesting scheme there. So I've mentioned masses of different examples here, but what actually I'd like to do for a moment is pause so that I'm going to actually end the slideshow so that I can paste into the chat a copy of this Padlet link. And what I'd like you to do just for a moment is to go into this link and please post if you've got any examples of your own in terms of the, examples you've got of co-creation in scholarship of teaching and learning or in subject research. But yeah, I'm just going to pause a moment and see if anyone would like to type into that Padlet. Please let me know if anyone has any problem getting in there. I can always try reposting the link if there's a problem. So yeah, I'll just pause a moment and see if anyone wants to add anything there. I can see a few people have accessed it. No one's been bold enough to post yet. If anyone hasn't used Padlet before, there should be a pink button at the right hand bottom of the screen. And in fact, I think I'm sharing that. Am I sharing that with you? Yeah, I'm sharing that with you at the moment. So you should be able to see that. And the pink plus button should let you type and add something. Brilliant. Thank you, first person who's been bold enough or fast enough to get the first one up there. So you're on your second scholarship project now. Recruited students as co-researchers. Great, great to hear. Brilliant. In your previous institution, you worked with graduate interns to do a substantial piece of research, which then informed the development of a new curriculum framework. That's wonderful. Worked on focus groups, thematic analysis. Lovely. I like the curriculum transformation one a lot. Involved in a couple of projects as a student. Brilliant. And thank you reminding me we have students in the audience, so it's wonderful to hear from you. Thank you for sharing that. Direct keen start. We have SRPP, which I'm not sure what that is, but which...
So Kathy, that's a student representation panel. So we've got so many students that the university will make sure we're not asking the same ones repeatedly. So it's a
Brilliant
participation panel.
That's fantastic. Thanks for clarifying as well. More next step. Oh, yeah, okay. Previous institution we had a scheme where we could, yeah, bursaries for staff. So that's one of those kind of project schemes. That's great. And they were rewarding. That's really lovely to hear as well. So feel free to keep adding to that, and I can always share around afterwards anything that we capture in that, if that would be helpful for people. But please do feel free to keep adding, because I am aware that it's not just me doing co-creation. It's not just the examples I've shared where it's happening. There are lots of examples, so do please keep adding to that if you'd like to. I'm just going to take us back to the PowerPoint, if I may, just aware of time, and I want to make sure I leave time for questions at the end. So I think what I really want to be honest about as well, there are challenges, definitely, and one of those I think is overcoming resistance, and that resistance comes from students, but it also comes from staff. And some of this is very different perhaps from the ways that we do things normally. And a second challenge related to that is that, we have to navigate institutional structures and practices and norms that don't necessarily make partnership or co-creation easy, or doesn't feel like it's a sort of natural expectation. And then we've got this challenge of ensuring that we establish an inclusive approach to what we do. But I think really important that we can see these and re-envisage these things as opportunities potentially. So that resistance, I think often if you share some of these really nice examples of what people are doing, sometimes people think, oh, well, maybe I could adapt that. Maybe I could do some of that in my practice. Or if you're a student and you've been involved in one project, you might be less reticent to be involved in another project. Or if you're a staff member and you hear a colleague talk about what they've done, sometimes that can really enable you to see things slightly differently. And these institutional structures, I think we have to remind ourselves that we are actually the university in many ways. So we are the people that can influence those structures and practices and norms, and gradually we can make changes to those. It's just that cultural change takes time, and it's going to take time to shift. But gradually we can actually influence some of those structures, whether it's things like the time it takes to get a course approved or a program approved. Perhaps we can influence those structures and say, can we try and work to make these systems work faster or be more adaptable to what we're trying to do. And that inclusive approach, I guess one thing to think about is whether you can involve the whole group. That is one approach. But one of the other approaches, which I'm just going to move to just now, is also thinking about the rewards. So if you are actually thinking of doing co-creation and it's outside of the curriculum, then there's a strong argument that we should be paying students for that work, because it's taking them away from other things they might be doing in that time. Some people pay, some people use vouchers, some people offer refreshments, some people offer course credit. The course credit would be more likely if you're working within the curriculum. And some people make sure that that's actually noted on someone's higher education achievement report. So these are different kind of reward mechanisms, and we could go into the details of the pros and cons of many of these, but I think really think carefully about, particularly if this is outside the curriculum, that students really should be recompensed in some way, and that if we want to be inclusive, if we don't pay, and this is in a student's own time, then we may actually shut down the possibilities of some students being able to be part of that research or that SOTL. So it's definitely worth thinking about carefully. So one of the other things I said that I would come to is thinking about the importance of relationships. And so one of the things I've argued recently is that co-creation needs positive relationships. So it's very, very hard to co-create something between staff and students if we haven't built trust and a good relationship, a good working relationship between staff and students. So if you've only just met and you're in that first meeting, why should we trust each other, if you like? Some work needs to be done here to kind of build trust and build an environment in which we think we could co-create and trust one another to share some of this responsibility and to to show that we respect one another. But if we do that and we go through the co-creation process, there's also a lot of evidence that helps build those relationships even further. And the reason I think relationships are so important is there is an enormous amount of evidence, that some of it dating way back and some of it more recently. There seems to be more interest in relationships recently. But there's masses of evidence that where students and staff have positive relationships, students experience greater academic success, they tend to have higher aspirations of their time at university, they tend to develop more personally and intellectually, there's greater student satisfaction and enhanced motivation. So these are things we really need to kind of pay attention to. It's a very significant kind of research evidence body that says, staff-student relationships matter. And also staff characteristics, attitudes and personality also matter. So this is interesting, staff who are warm and informal, friendly and flexible, accessible, approachable, available, empathetic, genuine, respectful, understanding and honest tend to have more positive impacts on students. So that's like a kind of wish list, isn't it? If we go into sort of a, I don't know, an interview for new staff, you know, we've got a wish list here of how we would like people to be. But I'm also realistic that we have a very varied staff body. But how much time do we spend talking to our staff about how important it is in the way they relate to students? I don't think it's necessarily something that we talk about enough. So as I kind of come to some conclusions, I think what I really want to sort of argue is that we have some changing of mindsets to do, I think, in terms of whatever the mode of kind of teaching or research we're approaching here. I think co-creation and partnership is really a different way of thinking about going about scholarship of teaching and learning, going about research. And I think one thing that can be really, really helpful is for us to constantly ask, where are the students whenever we're in conversations, when we're in meetings, when we're discussing what it is we're planning to do for our scholarship project? Are the students already in that meeting, or have you started without them? So I think it's a really good reminder to just keep asking, where are the students in this conversation? It's also important that not just getting students into the conversation, but that we really value those student perspectives, experience and contribution. So not that sort of, you know, tokenistic, we'll hear you, but we're not necessarily going to do anything in response to that. We need to actually do this as a respectful exchange of ideas and information. And I think really important to recognise here, there are many ways in which we can work in partnership in scholarship of teaching and learning, not just one way to do this. There are so many different ways, and no one way is necessarily better than another. So I think, you know, this is about us trying out a range of different things. So what I wondered whether we could sort of pause as the last thing before we go into questions is actually, if I come out of the slideshow again, what I would actually like to do, I'm going to stop sharing. What I would like to do is paste in the chat here another Padlet. Sorry, I do like my Padlets. And if you've just got a few moments, be very interesting just to pause to see whether anything I've said this morning has made you think what you might do as your next kind of steps in scholarship of teaching and learning and in partnership. And perhaps you were already thinking this, so I'm not going to take credit for you coming up with this in the last 45 minutes. But if you're willing to kind of share anything that you're sort of thinking, maybe something I plan to do to start or to extend in terms of students as partners in scholarship of teaching and learning, something that you plan to do. I'll just give you a few moments. I can see there's quite a few of you managed to get in, and we'll just pause a moment to let you respond to that, and then we'll hopefully have some time for questions. And I need to check, that'll give me a moment to check the chat as well, just to see if there's been questions coming through. So yeah, just take a moment if you've got a moment. That's brilliant. I can start to see people are posting. Well, this is wonderful. There's some brilliant things being added already. Great. Please do keep typing away. I think some great ideas already, and lovely to hear that somebody feels inspired to try something new, and some great specific ideas that people are posting here. Lovely. And there's some sort of references, and I'll make sure that people can have the slides, so that will have the references in them, so you can certainly have those. I'll pass that around. I wonder whether is this maybe a good point for me to pause and sort of say maybe there's some questions, and I can see there's a few in the chat, but I wasn't always good at keeping up with everything. So Claire, if
So,
you've seen
yeah, no,
any,
Kathy, I can
brilliant.
kick them off
You
if you
can
like.
help
So,
me off with that.
yeah,
That's great.
I've been scrolling for you. So,
Brilliant.
Kathy Chandler, do you want to just jump in and ask your question? It's about dissemination stage of scholarship and writing. So, Kathy Chandler, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks, Claire.
Thanks.
So you mentioned, Kathy, earlier about dissemination, making the scholarship public being one of the key characteristics of Subtle. And it was really interesting to hear you talking about students that had been involved in the dissemination of the scholarship. And I was thinking, so often we hear about scholarship projects where students have been involved, they've co-created everything up until the end when it gets to the dissemination, and then it's the lead academics that have written the paper. And I was wondering, is that just bad planning, or are there other factors involved there?
Great question, Kathy. I think it's a combination. So I think maybe we're not used to involving students so much in the dissemination, and some of the dissemination methods that we typically have in higher education aren't designed necessarily that we're expecting students to be involved in them. So I say that in terms of things like conferences. So staff can probably access, not always, but can sometimes access money for going to a conference. It's often quite hard to find money for students to go to conferences. So that's the kind of thing that a university that's serious about something like students as partners can make a real difference in. Could we create a small fund that students could apply to for going to conferences to present with their colleagues? So that's the kind of yeah, so there are some barriers in the way there that make it harder. I think also the kind of the publishing scenario, there's a lot of pressure on academic staff to publish academically. So go for the best journal you can. It's got to be in kind of fabulously academic ivory tower language, which almost is the antithesis of what we're suggesting we want this to be, because we want it to be sort of friendly to both staff and students. Students probably aren't necessarily drawn to reading philosophy of education journals, or so what I would say is that we've got a lot that we could do that can make that better. And I think there are more open access journals, there are alternative forms of going public. So students are doing brilliant work with things like series of podcasts. Students have got their own journals. Students, so there are some brilliant examples of how we could diversify the ways we go public, I think, that would be a bit more democratic, whilst also making sure we think carefully about involving students in those other more typical academic ways of going public. One little thing that I will say, though, is on the conference front, if we do take students to conferences, I say take students as if we're kind of grabbing them and taking, that sounds terrible, sorry. If we are trying to push for good practice of having students with us when we are going to conferences, then I really sort of feel very strongly about that we do that in a thoughtful way. So not the kind of classic thing where I do the introduction and introduce the students get to say their name, and then I talk for the next 30 minutes. And if you're lucky, the students get to present sort of one slide. So really taking it seriously in terms of how do we involve students in those kind of public dissemination, I think we need to think more about. So it's not a kind of tokenistic, bring your own student, like BYOS almost. So not meant to be offensive to any of the students in the room, but I do see some practices that make me think I'm not sure how serious people are about the involvement of students in that public dissemination. Thanks for your question, Kathy. I think I've rambled a little, but I think, yeah, it's a great question. It's a challenge.
There's some great ideas in there. I've been scribbling away. So Ian's just talking about, Ian McDonald is just talking about the OU context being a massively large demographic, lots of students, from all kinds of different backgrounds, and a lot of work going on around awarding gaps. And so one of the things he's saying, which I think is really interesting and links back to something I said at the beginning of the day, is around how much of this can we encourage within course design to minimise those risks and be more inclusive. I didn't know if you wanted to say anything about that, Kathy.
Oh, I love that question, Ian, because that's my kind of real passion, is actually for the whole group, whole cohort kind of co-creation. I think that's in a sense where we can, you don't have to even think about paying students, because they're doing their study. So it's course credit essentially that you're going to get at the end of this, whether you participate or not. It's kind of so to do it in a whole group, to me, is a really smart way forward. But then we have work to do, I think, with things like our postgraduate certificates in academic practice, or postgraduate certificates in learning and teaching that staff do. Where do we introduce this concept to staff? How do they learn to do that kind of co-creation within their classes? And notoriously, some of those early decisions will need to be made by the teacher before you go to class. But could you involve students even before class in influencing what might happen in the class following that? So I think where we can do this as a whole class, I think you've got the potential for this to have real impact. With a colleague at the University of Edinburgh did a study a few years ago, and I worked with her to look at co-creation examples across Scottish universities, and we had some really quite hard-hitting responses from a few students, one of whom said, if it hadn't been for the co-creator course, I would have dropped out of university. So there's something about the ethos that can be created with this if we're serious about giving voice and trying to encourage students to have more agency, that some students are picking up on as being significant for them. And I think that whole issue of trying to reduce that attainment gap and trying to address that attainment gap, I think for me, I think this is one of our sort of ways that we can approach that if we're working with whole classes, and really thinking how each person in that group can contribute in different ways.
Great, thanks, Kathy. Marina has her hand up, so I'll kind of come to you, Marina.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Really, really inspiring there, Catherine. Some really interesting points. Then just picking up on just a couple of things. In terms of, for me now, it is about realising that things were changing pre-pandemic and have just been speeded up in some ways during the pandemic. And it's about, whether we like social media, or whether we agree with social media and WhatsApp groups and Facebook groups and the cafe culture of our students. We have to move with the times, and we have to acknowledge that those ways of communicating or how our students like to communicate. So within that, we perhaps need to embrace that within our assessment methodologies and within a way to reach out and listen to and be listened to, I think, very much, and create that safe base to change hearts and minds and change, I think, what we do to kind of move forward. So thank you for that. Really inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you. And I mean, that makes me think of one of the ways that we've tried to do that. It's not, it's not TikTok, it's not maybe the latest social media, but we do a lot of blogging with students. So some of that is assessed as part of courses. But also what we try to do is we have a university-wide blog called Teaching Matters, which is really successful. We have huge numbers. I'll find the link shortly and paste it into the chat. But basically what we do in that is we are encouraging students to write as much as we are encouraging staff to write. And so students can write about their research. They can write about their experiences of teaching, and there's a whole range of things that they can put in that. But it's a great format again for going public. So our kind of equivalent of the what was I calling it? The Winchester Student Fellow Scheme. Our equivalent of that at Edinburgh is what we would call our Student Partnership Agreement funding. And we've made a decision this year that instead of asking for a final report at the end of projects, we actually ask them to write a blog for Teaching Matters. So it's not a stuffy final report that kind of, that sits on somebody's shelf. It's actually a blog that goes out there and tells the rest of the university community and people external to the community about, what they got from their student partnership project. So I've just pasted in the Teaching Matters link. Sorry for the blatant promotion there, but yeah, it's a lovely set of blogs that are many are staff authored, but some are student authored, and also we have a regular student illustrators project as well, where we get students to illustrate some of the blogs. So students from the Edinburgh College of Art are illustrating some of them too. So yeah.
Great. Thanks, Kathy. I'm just going to pick up before we finish on it. There's a comment on the Padlet about spreading the message is important, can be quite daunting if you've known it before, examples of how it's been done at the OU. And I was just going to ask Kate, I don't know if she minds, just coming in. It's not quite scholarship, but it's an interesting way of involving students and getting them to do research as part of their learning. Kate, do you want to just talk briefly about the EK313 follow-up project that you've done?
Yeah, hi Kathy, it's great to see you. Yes, I tutor on EK313, which is a module called Research with Children and Young People, and so it's covering kind of research skills around participatory research. And we've recently set up an award for students who, as they finish this module, and quite a few of them are finishing their degree as well, so becoming alumni, we've set up 3 awards that we can offer to students to put their research proposals actually into practice in their workplaces. So taking that step to becoming practitioner researchers with the support of our Children's Research Centre, with some additional workshops, which are great. I learned so much at every single one of our workshops, and the support of one-to-one mentoring with one of our ALs, one of our associate lecturers, throughout the year as they're putting that research into practice. And so the research is theirs, and the dissemination then is theirs, and that's what we're working on at the moment. Actually, is report writing and then dissemination, and what sort of dissemination is appropriate. And it's really inspiring to see students being the researchers and really taking that step forward, and maybe, we hope, coming back to postgraduate study at some point. Yeah. And we've got funding through access and participation, kind of money in our school has funded that. Yeah. That we wanted to know, Claire.
Thank you. I just think it's a great example, and something that, as I ponder it, you almost want to go, can we bring that into the curriculum? Can it be something that students, do as part of, how are we going to design these things into the curriculum? But I just thought, Kathy, that was a nice example. Someone was asking for something that we had done. I just thought it was a useful example.
Yeah.
Kathy, some final comments from you.
Well, and I was just spotting, it's like I can't stop. I was just spotting in the chat Tanya's point about the size of the class, the size of the group, or the size of the class. I think that does have an influence. If you've got a larger group of students, what's possible might be different. And that's where I think it is really important to engage with that range of what's possible, because it doesn't mean you can't do anything, but it might stop you doing one idea that you've got that would work with a small group of students. So I would just encourage you to look at some of the literature and to look at some of the examples that are out there, and think what's most suitable to the context in which you're working, and ask colleagues. We've got allies around the place. You might have colleagues who have tried something, and so yeah, do share amongst one another. It's great to have conversations about this with other colleagues, definitely. So just thank you. Thanks for the great comments. Thanks for those of you who posted into the Padlets, and I can download those and send them on to Claire afterwards, in case those are of use to everybody else.
Thank you, Kathy. Just picking up, there's a comment from Tanya just saying that a lot of these things are not for undergrads, rather for postgrads. I don't know, I can't resist letting you have a little stab at that one, Kathy. Go on.
Oh, yeah, you know I'm going to go for that, don't you? I'd really encourage you to think about doing this as soon as you can. So I don't think students are somehow going to get better at kind of working in partnership by not doing it for sort of the years before they get to postgrad. I appreciate postgrads will come with a different set of skills and experiences and ideas, but I would say there's nothing stopping us thinking about this from first year. So yeah, earlier the better in my view, but I would say that.
Yeah, you would say that. I think there's a lot of literature, isn't there, around research informed teaching that can sort of feed into this conversation. So I'm conscious that we're heading into lunchtime, and Kathy, thank you so much. It's been great to have you here. We've really enjoyed you joining us this morning.